Hi, my name is Dr. Eugene Lipov. I'm a Chief Medical Officer for Stella Center. I'm an anesthesiologist who's pioneered using stellar ganglion block for PTSD. We're going to discuss today PTSD being a real biological change in the brain, not a psychiatric disorder. We are going to talk about that PTSD can be caught like a virus, that it can be transmitted to a family member, and you may be leading a team of traumatized people and how to work with that.
Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with our special guest today, who is Dr. Eugene Lipov. He has developed an innovative procedure, the stellar ganglion block, and which is used for PTSD. He's the leading expert in his field. His research has earned him invitation to testify before the U.S. House Committee on Veteran Affairs back in 2010. He's a rising star and a guy you're going to find out a lot about in the next couple of years. You're going to hear his name come up all over the place because he is the creator of the Lipov procedure. It's a dual sympathetic reset. He's a guy who his patients refer to as the miracle man. It's a way to get us off this fight or flight mentality, which we have all been living in. And I think more and more, it's more of an epidemic. We think about PTSD as being very much something that is related to people who have served in the military. We might think about it in an extreme case of somebody who's been through a rape or that kind of situation, but there's much more to it. And I think that it's, as we were talking about in part 1, trauma and PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, is becoming more and more prevalent. We were talking about how PTSD is poorly named, in that rather than it being something that says, oh, you're crazy, or this is a mental illness, this is actually a physical issue that you can treat, maybe not once, but oftentimes once, in 5 to 7 minutes. So let's pick it up there, which is where we finished off, Eugene. On average, I mean, I don't know how many, you probably don't know the exact number, but how many people do you think you've treated with your system, with your method? Would you guess?
1,200, something like that.
1,200 people. So of the 1,200 people, how many people, what percentage of them just needed one shot?
Pretty small. I would
Pretty
say,
small?
yeah, I would say probably under 10%.
Under 10%. The others, do they need a couple of shots right away, or is it something that's done over time? How does that work?
It's variable.
Okay.
So we usually tell people you need 2.5 injections average.
Yeah.
But as we start doing the dual procedure and then doing right and left a lot of times, that seems to prolong the effect and increase the impact as well. So we're still studying all this. So I cannot give you 100%.
No. So I want people to understand that, it's just so we don't get them off on any false pretenses around this. And just so everybody understands the lay version of what it is you're doing. What's the lay version of it without getting too complicated for people?
So basically, there is nerves, fight and flight nerves start at the neck, go up to the brain. And if that's turned on continuously, then people have hypervigilance and overreactivity, those kind of symptomatology. When we put local anesthetic, numb up those nerves, that seems to turn off the symptoms of trauma within, let's say, 10 minutes. And then it also seems to rewire the brain to the pre-trauma state as far as fight and flight system. And then that could last, that's why a block that lasts 8 hours can last for years.
Wow. So the injection is into this area of nerves that go directly to the amygdala, the part of the brain that is fight or flight. Is that right?
Essentially, well, right next. We don't inject into the nerves, next to the nerves. So
next to the
come up,
nerves, right? It allows it to come down to a place that it was pre-trauma,
right.
and then once that happens, all that fight, flight, anxiety, that tension, that hypervigilant awareness settles. And then what happens in the front of the brain? What happens to the neocortex? Because you and I talked about this prior. When we are in a fight or flight situation, 27% of the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex is cut off. We don't think as well. We're not as creative. We're not as agile. And so when all this is come down, what happens?
Well, I'm not a neuroscientist in that aspect of it. So well, when somebody is in fight and flight nerves will do vasoconstriction. Will squeeze the arteries and veins,
Yes.
coronary arteries. So there's going to be less circulation. So if you can
Right.
relax that, there'll be increased circulation. And prefrontal cortex also is directly connected to the amygdala, so you have better control. Keep in mind, it's not one of the things that when I treat special ops, especially, or military people, one thing that they say, I don't want to be like totally docile after this procedure.
No,
That's not what it does.
no.
What it does, it gets you to the baseline, so you're nice and cool under circumstance. But if you need to get going, you can definitely get going. But now you're focused instead of being scared. So focus is a really good thing.
So you just brought up something that is really interesting to me because I'm fascinated by the mind, as you know, but I'm fascinated by the creative process of the mind, particularly. And for me, what's very interesting is when I read the biographies or see interviews with the most brilliant comedians, right? You know, you're talking about the John Belushis and the Robin Williams and George Carlin. You know, all of them were mad drug addicts, right? And they talked about difficulty in giving up the drug because they thought the drug was the edge. They thought that, you know, they would lose their creative genius if they gave up the drug. And I imagine that a Delta Force sniper would think that this might be my edge, and you're looking at taking my edge away. But that's not the case at all, is it?
You
Like,
mean
because they think that that hypervigilance is actually what's giving them the edge, but it's not.
it's opposite.
Right.
I think what it does, it makes you distracted. You want to be focused. You want to be laser focused, sometimes literally, and then you can actually do your job because you're focused and you're calm. And also, it's kind of important what happens when you go home and you treat your spouse nice as opposed to not nice if you're all wrapped up. You
Right.
have to be able to let go, the job, whatever you're doing, if you want to have a relationship.
So, you know, again, this is phenomenal because I want to talk a little bit more about the evidence of this because, you know, we were talking about Delta Force. You worked with somebody in Delta Force and you did it with the brain scans so we could see the difference in the brain before and after. And there was a difference in the brain at 40 hours. Is that right?
That's true.
So can you talk to us a little bit about what was happening there in the context of where the amygdala is lighting up versus the prefrontal cortex? So the fight, flight, stress part of the brain versus the higher cognitive parts of the brain.
So again, I'm not a neuroscientist of that type either.
Right.
So we were fortunate enough to work with Dr. Amen and Dr. Faber, who are neuroscientists and psychiatrists. So they did some brain scans for us before and after. And then they were able to notice a significant change in amygdala deactivation. So amygdala being overactive or areas similar to amygdala in similar area were overactivated during PTSD or PTSI. And after the block, there was a deactivation. Keep in mind, it's not the first time that's been observed. There was a paper written in Long Beach, California, VA, where they treated people with stellates, and they were able to do a PET scan before and after. And they were able to demonstrate deactivation of the amygdala and activation of prefrontal cortex. And of course, prefrontal cortex gives you more control over your behavior and amygdala. So it's all good in that sense.
So I hope that you're understanding this as you listen in, that this set of nerves that have been so hyper focused in a fight or flight mode are getting untangled, changing the way your brain functions, calming us down, and allowing us to be more focused, not less. I want to talk about that in the context of now leadership, because you and I talked about this in other conversations that certainly on Curiosity Bites, but in our own conversations, that for me, a lot of the work that I do, the private work that I do, I'm constantly working with very high level individuals who are very, very successful, who clearly to me are traumatized, and I can see they're traumatized. And I see that that trauma as one of my clients calls me Morpheus, because I see the trauma. I can see. I don't see the matrix. I see the trauma that's playing out through the behaviors and the behavioral source code of that person. And but it's again that, like I was saying about the comedian or the Delta person, they think that that is their edge, and they're afraid to let go of it. That if they let go of it, that's what's driving them so often to success. And in my mind, it seems like they're mainlining success, looking for the next hit, right? If when I get that success, and they get a hit decreasingly because of tachyphylaxis, the hit goes down, but they're going to pursue the next big hit. So talk to us about how you see this playing out in the leadership success driven world that we're living in.
Well, I think it depends on your background also. A lot of times people say you have to work so hard, you have to spend 100 hours per week is not uncommon to work very hard and then to achieve X.
Yes.
Because you always have to be working. But to me, I think if you know how to assign tasks, then a lot of times you may be able to hand some of that stuff off. And if you are not in your best mental condition, you're not going to be a good leader. You need to function at your highest peak efficiency. And that requires sleep, exercise, spend time unplugging, reading, obviously doing all the usual stuff, but you need to be consistently taking care of your body and your mind. That means food, appropriate food, meditation, all of that stuff. So I would, I really don't think, I've never run a big organization, so I really cannot speak to that. But I bet you can achieve more if you work smart, 70 hours per week instead of 120. So you're thinking clearer.
Yeah, of course. So let's look at this again, because I want to take it out of the framework of the way that we normally see PTSD, which is, again, we see it as a military thing. And I think there's then the obvious trauma, like we talked about with people who may have been through a beating in the street or, rape or something horrific like that. And then there's, as we talked about, there's a cumulative impacted trauma that somebody could have gone through, i.e., isolation of COVID. And then there is both, or all of the above, meaning the person may have had a very traumatic childhood, has been in isolation. It's now compounded. Now they're at work. They're overworked. So in many ways, it seems like there's an addictive process to the trauma now. So there's an addiction to the trauma. So if the person is treated with your method that creates this relaxation of the system, is it? I know you said you're not a neuroscientist, but is that when the person is going to need to come back? Because you talked about these wives are saying need to get your asshole shot.
Right. So you're asking why do people need to come back? If it works well, why doesn't it last forever? Is that the basic question?
Yeah, I'm asking, is that because they're re-traumatizing themselves? What is it?
I think there's a couple of things. One, it depends on childhood. It also
Yes.
depends on two generations. Let's say there was severe trauma two generations prior. That
Yes.
actually changes the DNA through epigenetic change. That's been
Right.
shown. I actually wrote a paper on that. And then, so if somebody has that, the chance of developing PTSD is much higher because
Yes.
now they're more sensitive to it. So let's say start with that. And if everything is doing great, then you may not be re-traumatized. It may last for a very long time. Let me give you another real world example.
Thank
So
you.
we took care of a 12-year-old child from North Carolina. So that young lady was molested by her uncle at 6 years old to 9 years old.
Oh my goodness.
Horrible, right? So she was brought to me by her mother, and we treated her, and she did very well for about a year. And then she came back for another treatment. And my particular perspective, I do not ask people what the trauma is. We just treat it, right? Because I don't think I need to get into and re-traumatize people. After we treated her, she volunteered saying that somebody tried to abduct her in the shopping mall. So
Wow.
the point is, it was another re-triggering.
So, okay, so let's address that because you and I have both met people who've been severely traumatized in different ways, in different situations, and the potential for them to be re-triggered is enormous, right? So there's any number of things that can re-trigger them.
Right.
And so would that make the treatment not work because they're constantly being re-triggered, or is this treatment desensitizing that trigger, pulling it back a little each time?
Well, again, let me give you another example. And I will give you a direct answer though. So there was a
Okay.
lady that was attacked in an elevator by her neighbor. And then every time she would see somebody look like him, she would shut down for about like a month. She wouldn't be
Yep.
able to function. People would bring her food. We did the block, and she ran into him on the street. She told him to fuck off and just walked away. So she was able to have a much better response
Yeah.
to him as
Yes.
opposed to before when she went into shut down system. Here, she was able to visualize it. It's like, he's not doing anything to me now. He cannot do anything to me now because I'm now healthy.
Right.
And she came back and she was fine. She came. She was so excited to see me the next day to tell me about it. So yes, it reduces the response to trauma, but it depends on your genetics, depends on the amount of trauma that's going on. So if somebody is being beaten up every day, there's no need to do the block because that probably is not going to do anything.
Right.
But if they've gotten themselves out of the situation, got treated, got psychological like CBT or things like that, cognitive behavior therapy, I think the chance of being re-triggered is much lower. And even if it does get re-triggered, it's a much lesser extent. Like she stopped shutting down. That's a big
Right.
change.
It's huge. So it seems like we are living in what could easily be described as the greatest point in history, technologically, etc. But at the same time, we seem to be living with an enormous amount of people who are walking around with undiagnosed trauma. I'm not suggesting you know, but what would you estimate is the people who are walking around? What's the percentage of people who are walking around with undiagnosed or unrecognized even trauma? Because I think that one of the things that we're dealing with, in this, as I said, great times, but at the same time, we have the prison system in the United States is crazy. It's insane. And there are people in there who are, uh, who literally go in, come out, go back in. It's a turnstile movement. Um, like, what do you think is the percentage of people who are walking around with undiagnosed
Well,
trauma?
when you say undiagnosed trauma, you mean trauma that has significant psychiatric impact.
Yeah,
That's
I mean that system is hyper vigilant. They're in that fight or flight state when they should be chilling out.
right. So I would say subclinical, you're looking at 60 to 70% of people, probably.
60, now I want you to hear that,
More than half.
right? More than half the people walking around. So your boss, your team, whoever you are, more than 50% of those people are walking around with some significant undiagnosed trauma that is directly impacting their functionality as human beings, not just as members of your team. That is like for most people.
Well, I think it's realistic. Well, the other thing is, think about it. So if you look at PTSD diagnosis, if you read most articles, they would say it's 8 to 12%.
Yes.
That's a typical answer, right?
Yes.
However, let's look at some other numbers. So 1 out of 3 women in the United States is sexually assaulted.
Yes.
50% of those people will develop PTSD. So right there, the numbers don't quite match up.
No.
Since the pandemic, viral pandemic, many people have been talking about mental pandemic.
Yes.
Because of isolation, fear of death, loss of wages, you name it. All of that is really setting up this terrible onset of poor psychiatric health. And then you think about people being short, being anxious, being angry, willing to be hyper aggressive. And the other part is, you probably know it better than I do, but a lot of time violence is a way to calm down a nervous system, right? So if you look at least the United States, the violence has really escalated markedly. And I think it's a big part of that issue.
Yeah. As I said, the reason alcohol has been banned on planes is because of the aggression. And for me, it's like, that is the surface level of people like just getting, oh my God, there's maybe a problem here. Yeah, but I'm not getting on a plane, so it's fine. Yeah, not so much. Not so much. I think that we're going to see mass shootings and those kinds of things go up, not down.
Oh, no, well, absolutely. The gun laws are interesting. But the other part, though, is even if you're not getting in the plane and you've had now 12 drinks, and now you hear a barking dog from your neighbor, it's a much easier jump to grab your gun, which you have access to, and go shoot the dog and the neighbor.
Yeah.
If you didn't have those drinks and you weren't traumatized, you're not trying to, the term I like to use is you're taking your PTSD for a swim. It's why do people use cocaine? Why do people use alcohol? I think a lot of times it's self-medication because they're so uncomfortable.
Yeah. As you've heard me say before, it's part of my life philosophy and allowing me to return to a state of compassion is everybody's trying to feel better.
Yeah.
If I can remember that when it's difficult to remember, everybody's trying to feel better. There's some pain going on somewhere. And the reason they're barking at me or I'm barking at them may have nothing to do with what's going on, but everything to do with whatever else has gone on. In our men's work, we used to say, put your hand up if you've been angry, like really angry in the last 5 days. And everybody would put their hand up and I go, okay. By the way, I'd say, even if it was inside, nobody knew. So everybody put their hand up, right? I go, okay. So now I'm going to say to you, you weren't angry. What were you? And they go, I was angry. Oh, I was frustrated. No, that's part of anger. What were you? Disappointed? That's also part of anger. No, what were you? Oh, you were feeling hurt. You were feeling sad. You were feeling other emotions that weren't as acceptable. It was easier and quicker and more societally comfortable for you to be angry. So you went to that. And so a lot of the time, I think that a lot of the things that why trauma is not recognized is because we've got these socially acceptable responses that then tilt over the edge. So we go from being pissed off in the car and shouting at somebody with our windows up to winding the window down, shouting at the person, and a gun comes out, and it gets crazy because, as you said, it's cumulative. Yeah. So in the context of that, let's take this a little bit step further, because I want people to grasp this, because this is why I think the work you're doing is so profoundly important because, you're talking about 50 to 60 people, 50 to 60% of people walking around with undiagnosed trauma, and you've developed this amazing treatment that's doing miraculous work, not just from people who've gone through extreme states of trauma, but there is something that I talk about, which is situational trauma. And situational trauma is what I call by comparison. So I'll give you a quick example, see if it makes sense. I started to travel in my early 20s, and I lived in Northern England. I was born in poverty, and I began to travel. And I started to notice in these countries that I was going to, which were not on the normal beaten track, where people were very poor, but extremely happy. And I would notice, particularly if I was around other travelers, who were from first world countries, and they go, how come these people have got nothing and they're so happy? And yet people who were from where I was from, where I grew up with abject poverty, were miserable and angry and addicted to all these things. I wasn't seeing that there. And there was a situational trauma of living in direct comparison with people who were living in affluence while we were living in poverty. These people didn't know that. They were living in their own joy of where they were. That comparison was traumatizing. And now we live in this social media, vastly comparative world. I think we're all getting traumatized every day by that. I'd love your input on that.
Well, I think that's true. It's part of the capitalist system. Is the idea is, it's like, do you really need the latest iPad, the latest vehicle, whatever? I think a lot of advertising, it produces tension. In order to sell things, you need to produce tension.
Yes.
So I think a lot of that. So I think we're going to see some of that being resolved, I think, since the pandemic, because people are learning how to live with less.
Mm-hmm.
And not being as easily manipulated, shall we say? That, it's like, if it's Coke, it doesn't have to be the super type Coke, or so on. So I do believe so. Place like in Russia, very few people had anything. So, they didn't have much. And I'm not saying Russians are necessarily happier than Americans, but there is certainly misery loves company. I think the whole thing, if everybody's miserable, nobody knows any different. You don't know that you can be driving a Maserati. You don't know any of that. Everybody has, one car amongst, 250 people, and
sure,
they had the same resources, the same food, the same all this. So it was pretty limited. And I do believe that's true. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I just, I think that when we look at the crime in the first world, and we look at the prison system, and we look at all these things, we're actually looking at trauma, and we're looking at trauma playing out. And if you're talking about 50 to 60 people, 50 to 60% of people walking around undiagnosed, that would certainly include the people who are going in and out of prisons, who are dealing with living in prisons, who, got 25 years for carrying a 1 ounce bag of pot, that is now legal in the state that sent them to jail. There's a lot of pieces in there. I want to talk a little bit here as we move towards the end of the show, because I want people to grasp this in a non-military, non-Delta Force, non-extreme way that we might think about it. Can you share with us a case of somebody you have treated that is not part of that world, that's one of your sort of favorite?
Well, I feel sad that people have been through that, but I do have examples, unfortunately, for almost any type of trauma. So, and this is somewhat extreme trauma. Certainly not military. Certainly not Delta Force. Not that. So this gentleman was accused of raping and killing his mother-in-law, and he was put in jail for 12 years. He was exonerated in a higher exoneration project based on DNA evidence. And they found the guy who actually did it and all of that.
So after 14 years, he'd served 14 years wrongly accused,
yeah,
wrongly found guilty.
right,
DNA proves he's innocent.
correct.
Wow, that's trauma.
He comes out severe PTSD and gives PTSD to his wife, which is, it's called secondary PTSD. So I've treated both of them. They did very well. Unfortunately, they just got triggered because the wife's mother just died. So they're gonna need to have another injection. But overall, they've done very well post those injections.
What's the longest gap you've done between shots? You know, if somebody's come back and needed it again?
I don't know. I don't have an answer necessarily to that, but I'll tell you the longest outlier. Well, there are two outliers I want to tell you about that I'm aware of. One of them was a gentleman who was military. We treated him 10 years ago. He had one injection. He's still doing great.
Wow.
And now the first military guy we treated was 16 years ago. He had two injections 16 years ago. And then he saw fireworks and it flipped him back a little bit. So that was 3 months later. And then he's still doing well 16 years later.
So what's the assessment? Is it a self-assessment? Does a person say, you know, do they, you know, we know there are many tests online for see if you've got PTSD. Is it that? Is it somebody goes, oh, I think I've got PTSD? I mean, like Ricky Martin recently came out, and I know you were asked to advise on that. You know, how does a person know, you know what, I probably need to go see Dr. Lipov?
Well, thanks for asking that question. I put up a website which is free and there's no, this is just informational. It's called, the website is doihaveptsd.org. So basically, there's only one self-assessment questionnaire that's out there. It's called PCL, PTSD checklist. There used to be PCL4, now there's PCL5. If you get to a certain level of numbers, then technically it's a survey tool. You would be diagnosed with PTSD. The formal diagnosis can only be done by a psychiatrist, but that's a pretty good tool.
Okay. So what if somebody watching, listening to us says, you know, there's no way in the world I can get my husband or my partner to go take a test like that, let alone go see a psychiatrist. We've got way too much ego for that, way too much hypervigilance for that, way too much everything for that. But they're living with the impact of living with somebody who is traumatized, because that's a lot of the cases. I know you treat the spouses of people who have been traumatized, the spouses of people who've served. What do those people need to do? So what do you think?
So I think there are a couple of things. One of the things you can kind of use the website we talked about and see if your significant other fits the criteria.
Right.
See if there are a lot of those symptoms, if they're hypervigilant, if they're very short-tempered, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things you may want to do, and you know, each station is different, is potentially just be upfront and discuss it. Say, you know, this is really a big problem. It's affecting me. It's affecting our family. Maybe you can take a test and see if you have it. It's totally anonymous. See if they want to do it. If they do it, and if they have a label, even though I don't like term PTSD, maybe they'll look at possible treatments.
Yeah, I think that what you just brought up there is so important, and that's why I like that you've given people. And again, you can give out that URL for where. Give it again if you wouldn't mind, for where they can go and get the test.
Doihaveptsd.org.
Doihaveptsd.org. If you go there, like Dr. Eugene said, it's anonymous. So you can do it on your own. You can do it in the quiet of your office or your home, and nobody will ever know you were there. You can simply go, and it's on you. Like you just do it. It's
Yeah.
fine. At the end of it, you go, oh, I'm good. Or, oh, okay. Now you can look at the other options. But trying to live with something, which is what so many of us, particularly who are driven leaders, driven people who are high performance, whether they're in sports or performance or business, we're often not willing to go to that place of self-examination. And this is a way to go there again, anonymously, and then say, this is a way for me to perform not as high, but higher, and have a heck of a lot more joy in your life in the process, because it's no fun living in a trigger awareness world. I know I lived there and it sucks.
Keep in mind, it's not just you. Think about your family and your kids
Yes.
and your dog. Sometimes people come back, they're angry, they kick the dog, they kick the kids, the wife. That's not good.
Yeah, not good at all. Eugene, I have loved our conversation. I'm always grateful to speak to you. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I feel genuinely that I'm honored to have this conversation with you and to make people aware of what it is you're doing, because it's not, I mean, there are other SBG,
Teleganglion block.
yeah, there's lots of those around, but they're not doing what you're doing in the way that you're doing it. And I understand the difference it's making, and you're now working with, as you said, Fort Bragg and many other institutes, and Dr. Amen, who many of us may be familiar with from the men's brain stuff on PBS and those kinds of things, is now working side by side with you. I mean, there's a lot of movement towards this, to helping people with this. I want to thank you for being part of this. Again, before we finish, I want to make sure that everybody knows how to find out about you, find out about all the resources around you, and how they can step into those and find out more.
Yeah, if you look up drugenelipov.com, I'm also a chief medical officer for Stella. So it's stellacenter.com. And we have a number of offices where people have been trained appropriately to perform this procedure. I think that will give people a lot of information, and hopefully they can get help they need.
Wonderful. Again, sincere thanks to you, my friend. I always appreciate it. And I cannot relay enough to you, dear listener, the significance of this work and the significance of this, the way this man is doing this work, and the potential impact on all of our lives as we move forward into, greater technology, but potentially greater opportunity to live in a stressed out way. And maybe this is a way for us to reset ourselves and come back to normal. There's no disrespect here to anything else that's medical or procedural, meaning therapy or any of those things. Please go do those. If they help you, do them. Meditate, do all the things. But if you want to find out, go to the website, check for yourself, and then maybe potentially look at the impact it's having on the people around you. I want to thank you, Dr. Eugene Lipov, for being with us. I want to thank you, dear listener. And if you want to hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode that you've been listening to, or any past episodes, you can go to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. It's the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. Because it doesn't matter how successful you are, if your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or for your organization, go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com, because unified actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for both individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. We do appreciate that. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about trauma. Are you living with it undiagnosed? Are you leading a team of undiagnosed people who have trauma? And what might happen if you confronted that, not aggressively, but directly? How would that impact not only your life, but the lives that you work with, the lives that you are intimately connected to. You are worthy of living in a non-hypervigilant state. And there is now a miracle treatment. I'm Dov Baron, and I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.